The day I realized I wasn't weak, nothing dramatic happened. No big speech, no public victory, no applause. I was just sitting in my car, hands on the steering wheel, trying to convince myself to walk into work. For months, I had been telling myself the same quiet story. I'm just not built for pressure. Before we begin, please support MindShift Stories by subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories with the world. I worked in a mid-sized marketing firm in a busy downtown building. Nothing glamorous, just long meetings, tight deadlines, and the constant hum of people trying to prove they belong there. I was good at my job, at least on paper. My performance reviews were always solid, reliable, consistent. But inside, I felt different. Every time a new project came in, especially the high visibility ones, I felt this immediate tightening in my chest. My mind would race ahead of reality. What if I mess this up? What if they realize I'm not as capable as they think? What if this is the project that exposes me? I never said these thoughts out loud. I smiled in meetings, I took notes, I nodded confidently, but internally, I was always bracing myself. I believed something about myself that felt like a fact. Other people are naturally strong. I endure. There's a difference, I used to think. Strong people speak up. They take risks. They don't overthink every email before sending it. They don't replay conversations in their heads at 2 a.m. I did. And because of that, I assumed I lacked something fundamental. Outside of work, my life looked stable. I had a small apartment, a decent routine, a couple of close friends. I went to the gym a few times a week. I paid my bills on time. I wasn't falling apart. But internally, I constantly measured myself against an invisible standard of strength, and I was always falling short. The subtle tension started building when a new director joined our department. His name was Marcus. Calm, observant, not overly talkative. The kind of person who listened longer than most people were comfortable with. In his first team meeting, he asked a simple question: "What's something you avoid doing here?" The room went quiet. People laughed awkwardly. Someone joked about avoiding Excel spreadsheets. Another person said answering emails after 5 p.m. Marcus didn't laugh. He just nodded and said, "Interesting." When it was my turn, I shrugged and said, "I guess presenting." That wasn't entirely true. I could present, I just hated it. He looked at me for a second longer than usual, not judging, just noticing. A week later, he assigned me to lead a presentation for a potential client. High stakes, company-wide visibility. When I saw my name next to lead presenter, my first thought wasn't excitement. It was panic. I walked into his office later that afternoon and closed the door behind me. "I'm not sure I'm the best person for this," I said carefully. He leaned back in his chair. "Why not?" I gave him practical reasons. Sam has more experience with this client type. Emily's better at handling tough questions. I'm more comfortable doing back-end strategy. He listened, then he said something that unsettled me. "You're not lacking skill, you're avoiding discomfort." I felt defensive immediately. "I'm just being realistic." "Maybe," he said calmly, "but sometimes realism is just fear wearing a responsible mask." That line stuck with me longer than I wanted to admit. For the next few days, I kept replaying it in my head. Fear wearing a responsible mask. I told myself he didn't understand me. He hadn't seen the nights I'd spent over preparing just to feel barely ready. He didn't know how loud my inner critic was. But something didn't sit right. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't avoiding presentations because I couldn't do them. I was avoiding the feeling of being exposed. The presentation day came faster than I expected. That morning in my car gripping the steering wheel, I seriously considered calling in sick. My mind offered convincing arguments. "You're not feeling 100%. You could reschedule. This isn't worth the stress." But underneath all that noise was a quieter thought. If you walk away now, what story are you reinforcing? I had spent years believing I was someone who couldn't handle pressure, someone who survived but didn't lead, someone who endured but didn't step forward. And suddenly, I realized something uncomfortable. That belief wasn't based on facts. It was based on avoidance. That was the turning point. Not courage, not confidence, just a decision. I opened the car door. Inside the conference room, my hands were slightly cold. My voice felt unfamiliar when I started speaking. I noticed every small stumble. Every pause felt longer than it probably was. But something unexpected happened about 10 minutes in. I stopped monitoring myself. Instead of thinking, how am I doing? I started thinking about the client, their concerns, their questions, their perspective. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it shifted. It wasn't about protecting my image anymore. It was about communicating clearly. When it was over, there was no dramatic applause, just nods, a few follow-up questions, a handshake. Normal. Marcus caught my eye as people were leaving. He didn't give me a big thumbs up, he just said, "See?" That was it. But the real impact didn't happen in that room. It happened later that night, sitting quietly in my apartment. I was replaying the presentation in my head, as usual, noticing the parts I could have done better. Then I paused. I had been nervous, I had doubted myself, I had felt exposed, and I had still done it. That realization felt different. I used to think strength meant not feeling fear, but what if strength was acting while feeling it? I started examining other parts of my life through that lens. The difficult conversation I had with a friend last year. I thought I handled it poorly because I was anxious the whole time, but I still showed up and said what needed to be said. The time I moved to a new city alone, I remember how uncertain I felt, but I still packed my things and left. The months I supported my family during a financial strain, I felt overwhelmed almost daily, but I didn't collapse. I had labeled myself as weak because I felt things intensely, but maybe feeling deeply wasn't weakness. Maybe it was awareness. The more I reflected, the more I saw a pattern in my psychology. Every time I felt fear or doubt, I assumed it was evidence that I couldn't handle something. But what if those feelings were simply signals that something mattered? I began noticing how often we misinterpret our internal experiences. If we feel nervous, we assume we're unprepared. If we feel uncomfortable, we assume we're incapable. If we feel uncertain, we assume we're inadequate. But feelings aren't verdicts, they're information. That shift in perspective changed more than just how I approach presentations. I started volunteering for projects I would have avoided before, not recklessly, but intentionally. I spoke up in meetings when I had something valuable to add, even if my heart raced a little bit. I stopped waiting to feel ready, because I realized something quietly powerful. Readiness is often just familiarity, and you don't become familiar with something by avoiding it. Externally, my life didn't transform overnight. I didn't suddenly become the loudest person in the room. I didn't turn into some fearless leader. But internally, something steadied. When anxiety showed up, I didn't immediately interpret it as proof of weakness. I would think, okay, this matters to me. That's why I feel this. That small reframe reduced the internal battle. And when you're not fighting yourself, you have more energy for the actual challenge. Months later, Marcus and I had a casual conversation after work. I told him that his comment about fear wearing a responsible mask had stuck with me. He smiled slightly. "Most people aren't as fragile as they think," he said. "They're just not as collected enough evidence of their own resilience." That word, evidence, felt important. I realized I had spent years collecting evidence of my flaws. Every awkward pause, every mistake, every moment of doubt. But I ignored the evidence of endurance, the late nights I'd pushed through, the risks I quietly took, the uncomfortable decisions I survived. Human behavior is shaped by the stories we repeat internally. And I had been repeating a story of limitation. When I changed the story, not by lying to myself, but by looking at fuller evidence, my perception shifted. The hidden truth wasn't that I had suddenly become stronger. It was that I had always been stronger than I allowed myself to see. Strength, I discovered, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It often looks like a quiet person walking into a room they'd rather avoid. It looks like someone speaking while their voice shakes slightly. It looks like choosing growth over comfort, even when comfort is tempting. It looks ordinary from the outside. That's why we miss it. We assume strength should feel powerful, but sometimes it just feels uncomfortable. Today, I still feel nervous before big meetings. I still overthink occasionally. I still have moments where that old belief tries to resurface. But now, when it does, I don't treat it as truth. I treat it as a habit, and habits can change. If you had asked me a year ago where I would discover strength, I might have said through achievement, recognition, or some external validation. But I found it in something much simpler: a decision not to escape discomfort, a willingness to question my own assumptions, a quiet moment in a parked car where I chose to step out instead of drive away. Looking back, I wonder how many of us mislabel ourselves. How many capable people walk around believing they're fragile simply because they feel deeply? How many decisions are shaped not by lack of ability, but by misunderstood fear? Maybe the real shift isn't becoming stronger. Maybe it's recognizing the strength that has been there all along. And maybe the next time you feel that tightness in your chest before something important, it's not a warning that you can't handle it. Maybe it's evidence that you already can.